The morning rain drummed a steady rhythm against the tall windows of timeless books and binding. As Amelia Parker adjusted her wire-rimmed reading glasses and carefully examined the spine of a leather-bound volume from 1847. At 52, her hands moved with the practiced precision of someone who had spent decades working with delicate materials, though the sharp intelligence in her dark eyes suggested a mind that had once grappled with far more complex challenges than repairing torn book spines and faded gilt lettering. Her small shop occupied the ground floor of a narrow brick building on Pine Street in Seattle's Capitol Hill district. The space was cramped but organized with military precision. 3 professional-grade sewing machines arranged near the large front windows, hundreds of spools of thread organized by color and weight, rolls of leather and cloth stacked with geometric exactness, and specialized tools arranged on pegboards like surgical instruments. The back room served as both workspace and sanctuary, filled with the scent of old paper, binding glue, and the leather conditioner she mixed herself from a recipe learned decades ago. Most customers who entered Timeless Books and Binding saw exactly what they expected to see. A middle-aged woman in well-worn jeans and a simple cotton blouse, her graying brown hair pulled back in a practical bun, wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose as she bent over whatever restoration project currently occupied her attention. They brought her their treasured family Bibles with cracked spines, their grandfather's journals with pages falling out, their college textbooks that had seen too many semesters of abuse, and she fixed everything with quiet efficiency and reasonable prices. What they didn't know, what nobody in Seattle knew, was that the soft-spoken bookbinder who lived in the apartment above her shop had once been Dr. Amelia Chen, one of the world's most renowned cybersecurity experts and ethical hackers. 15 years ago, her reputation in the technology sector had been legendary. She could identify security vulnerabilities that other experts missed entirely, decode encrypted communications that seemed mathematically impossible to crack, and trace digital footprints across the darkest corners of the internet with an intuitive understanding that bordered on supernatural. Dr. Amelia Chen had worked for Fortune 500 companies, consulted with law enforcement agencies, and lectured at conferences where tickets cost more than most people's monthly salary. Her apartment in Manhattan's Upper East Side had been filled with cutting-edge computer equipment, multiple monitors displaying streams of code, and walls lined with awards recognizing her contributions to digital security. She had been featured on magazine covers, interviewed on technology podcasts, and courted by venture capitalists eager to fund whatever project she might pursue next. That life had ended on a cold November morning when she discovered that CyberShield Technologies, the company she had helped build from a startup into a billion-dollar corporation, was systematically selling backdoor access to their clients' systems to foreign intelligence services. The betrayal had been comprehensive and devastating. Not just a single rogue employee or isolated incident, but a coordinated effort involving the company's senior leadership to monetize their privileged access to America's most sensitive digital infrastructure. When she had tried to expose the conspiracy, presenting her evidence to federal authorities and industry regulators, she discovered that the corruption extended far beyond CyberShield. Key officials in regulatory agencies had been compromised, law enforcement contacts had been bought or intimidated, and the network of complicit parties included people she had considered friends and mentors. The evidence she had painstakingly gathered over months of investigation mysteriously disappeared from secure servers. Backup files were corrupted, and witnesses began recanting their statements or refusing to cooperate. Within weeks, the narrative had been completely reversed. Falsified documents suggested that Dr. Amelia Chen herself had been the one selling classified information, that her accusations against CyberShield were an attempt to deflect attention from her own crimes. Bank records were altered to show suspicious deposits. Email communications were doctored to suggest treasonous contact with foreign agents. And digital forensics, conducted by the same people she was trying to expose, supported the manufactured evidence against her. The frame-up had been masterful in its completeness. Former colleagues turned against her. Media outlets ran stories questioning her loyalty and mental stability, and federal prosecutors prepared an indictment that would have resulted in life imprisonment or possibly even execution for treason. As the walls closed in around her, Amelia realized that her only choice was to disappear completely. With help from Marcus Wong, a former military intelligence officer who had become a close friend during their work on classified projects, Amelia had staged her own death. The car accident on a remote mountain road in Colorado had been carefully orchestrated. Skid marks consistent with icy conditions, a vehicle that plunged into a river deep enough to make body recovery unlikely, and just enough physical evidence to convince investigators without providing remains that could contradict the fabricated story. For 6 months, she had hidden in a cabin owned by Marcus's family, undergoing the painful process of transforming from Dr. Amelia Chen into someone completely different. Her naturally dark hair was lightened to brown with gray highlights. Her olive complexion was altered with makeup techniques learned from theatrical professionals, and minor cosmetic surgery changed the shape of her nose and jawline enough to fool facial recognition systems. More importantly, she had to learn to move differently, speak differently, and think like someone whose life experiences were completely unlike those of a world-renowned cybersecurity expert. The most difficult part had been choosing what to do with her new identity. She couldn't return to technology work. The risk of recognition was too great, and the digital trails would eventually lead back to her real identity. She needed something completely removed from her former profession, something that would allow her to remain anonymous while providing the mental stimulation necessary to prevent the depression and anxiety that often accompanied such dramatic life changes. Books had been Marcus's suggestion. "You've always been about preserving and protecting information," he had told her during one of their late-night planning sessions. Bookbinding is just information preservation in analog form. Plus, it's detailed work that requires patience and precision, qualities you already have in abundance. The transition to Seattle had taken another year of careful preparation. Marcus had helped create a complete background for Amelia Parker, including employment records showing 5 years of work at a bookbinding shop in Portland, which had conveniently burned down, destroying all physical records. References from customers who had never existed, but whose contact information led to phone numbers Marcus controlled, and even a social media presence documenting a quiet life devoted to book restoration and preservation. The apartment above the Pine Street shop had been perfect for her needs. Isolated enough to prevent casual social contact, but located in a neighborhood where a quiet, middle-aged woman attracted no attention whatsoever. She had spent months establishing her new identity in the community, volunteering at the local library, joining a book club that met monthly at a nearby coffee shop, and gradually building the reputation of Timeless Books and Binding as Seattle's most skilled and reliable restoration service. For 15 years, the strategy had worked flawlessly. Amelia Parker had become real in ways that Dr. Amelia Chen had never been. She knew her neighbors' names, understood the subtle dynamics of Capitol Hill's small business community, and had built relationships based on genuine human connection rather than professional networking. The work itself had proved surprisingly satisfying. There was something deeply calming about the methodical process of taking damaged books and making them whole again, preserving knowledge and history for future generations. But old habits died hard. Despite her commitment to leaving the digital world behind, Amelia had maintained certain security measures that would have seemed paranoid to most people, but felt like basic prudence to someone who had lived through systematic betrayal. Her apartment was equipped with subtle electronic countermeasures that would detect surveillance equipment. Her computer system was hardened against intrusion with custom-built security protocols, and she maintained secure communication channels with Marcus Wong, who had become a successful private security consultant and remained her only connection to her former life. The morning that would shatter her carefully constructed anonymity began like any other. Amelia arrived at her shop at 7 o'clock, made coffee using beans from a local roaster, and settled down to work on a project that had occupied her attention for the past week. Restoring a collection of love letters from the 1920s that had been damaged in a house fire. The papers were delicate, the ink faded, and several letters had suffered water damage that made the text barely legible. As she worked, Amelia found herself thinking about the young couple whose correspondence she was preserving. Their letters revealed a relationship that had survived the challenges of the Great Depression, geographic separation during World War II, and decades of ordinary life filled with extraordinary devotion to each other. The woman had been a teacher, the man an engineer, and their letters documented not just personal affection, but also the social and political changes they had witnessed over nearly 60 years of marriage. This was why she had come to love bookbinding and restoration work. Every project told a story, and every story connected her to the broader human experience in ways that computer code never could. The couple whose letters she was preserving had faced real challenges: economic hardship, world war, the loss of children, career setbacks. And their written correspondence was a testament to resilience and hope that inspired her daily work. The bell above her shop door chimed at exactly 9:30, announcing the arrival of her first customer of the day. Amelia looked up from the letters to see a man in his mid-40s examining her shop with the calculating gaze of someone conducting an evaluation rather than a casual visit. He was tall and well-dressed, wearing an expensive gray suit that fit him perfectly, Italian leather shoes that probably cost more than most people's rent, and a watch that she recognized as a limited edition Patek Philippe worth at least $50,000. But it wasn't his obvious wealth that triggered Amelia's internal warning systems. It was his demeanor, the way he moved through her shop like someone who was used to being the most important person in any room. The manner in which his eyes cataloged every detail of her modest business as if assessing its value, and most importantly, the subtle tells that suggested he was actively evaluating her rather than simply looking around. "Are you the owner?" he asked, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of someone who had never been denied anything he wanted. "I am," Amelia replied, carefully setting down the letter she had been working on and giving him her full attention. "I'm Amelia Parker. How can I help you today?" The man stepped forward and placed a leather-bound book on her counter with the careful precision of someone handling a fragile treasure. The volume was clearly old, probably mid to late 19th century, based on the binding style and the patina of the leather, and had obviously been well cared for despite its age. The gold lettering on the spine was faded, but still legible, reading "Personal Journal" in elegant script. "This belonged to my great-grandfather," the man said, his voice taking on a reverent tone that seemed slightly rehearsed. "It's a personal journal from the 1870s, apparently quite valuable from a historical perspective. Some of the pages have been damaged over the years, and I need it restored for a family presentation I'm making next week." Amelia picked up the journal and began her standard examination process. The leather binding was in remarkably good condition for its age, suggesting it had been stored carefully and handled minimally over the decades. The paper was high-quality rag paper that had aged well, though several pages showed signs of water damage along the edges, and the original thread binding had loosened enough that the book felt fragile when opened. But as she examined the journal more closely, something began to feel wrong. The wear patterns weren't quite consistent with a book that had been sitting in storage for over a century. There were subtle signs of recent handling. Microscopic fibers from modern fabrics caught in the binding, a faint smell of contemporary leather conditioner that shouldn't have been present on an untreated antique, and most tellingly, several pages that showed evidence of recent writing despite the aged appearance of the ink. "This is beautiful work," she said carefully, not voicing her suspicions. "The leather is in excellent condition for its age, and the paper quality is outstanding. You're right that it will require careful restoration. The binding needs to be reinforced, several pages need stabilization, and the water damage along the edges needs to be addressed before it spreads further." "How long will that take?" the man asked, and there was something in his tone that suggested the question was more important than casual curiosity would warrant. "Proper restoration can't be rushed," Amelia explained, falling back on the patient professionalism she had cultivated over 15 years of customer service. "A project like this requires careful assessment of each page, selection of appropriate materials that match the original construction, and techniques that preserve the historical integrity of the piece. I'd estimate 2 to 3 weeks for complete restoration." The man's expression darkened noticeably. "That's not acceptable. I need this completed by Friday, less than a week from now. This is for a very important family presentation, and the timing cannot be adjusted." "I understand the urgency," Amelia replied, keeping her voice level despite the growing sense that something about this entire interaction was fundamentally wrong. "But quality restoration work simply cannot be compressed into arbitrary timelines. If you need something done quickly, I can recommend a couple of other binders in the area who might be able to accommodate your schedule, though I can't guarantee their work will meet the standards this piece deserves." "You don't understand who I am," the man said, his polished facade beginning to crack. "I'm Marcus Blackwood, CEO of Apex Technologies. We're one of the largest employers in this city, and we have contracts with major corporations throughout the Pacific Northwest. When I need something done, it gets done." The name hit Amelia like a physical blow, though she managed to keep her expression neutral. She had heard of Apex Technologies, of course. The company had been featured prominently in local news for their work on Seattle's smart city infrastructure projects. They had contracts to manage traffic control systems, monitor public utilities, and coordinate emergency response communications throughout the metropolitan area. From a cybersecurity perspective, they had access to virtually every critical system in the city. But Marcus Blackwood's behavior was triggering every instinct she had developed during her years as Dr. Amelia Chen. The combination of arrogance, entitlement, and barely concealed threat was familiar. She had encountered similar personalities during her investigation of CyberShield technologies. In her experience, people who demanded special treatment and used their corporate positions as leverage were often hiding something that couldn't bear close scrutiny. "I appreciate your position, Mr. Blackwood," she said carefully, "and I understand the importance of meeting your deadline. Let me see what I can do to accelerate the process without compromising the quality of the restoration. Perhaps I can have it completed by Monday. That would be the absolute fastest timeline I could manage while still doing justice to such a valuable piece." Blackwood studied her with the calculating gaze of someone reassessing a situation that wasn't proceeding according to plan. "Monday might be acceptable," he said finally. "But I need to stress the importance of discretion regarding this project. The journal contains private family information that should not be discussed with anyone else. I trust you understand the importance of client confidentiality." "Of course," Amelia replied. "All of my restoration work is treated with complete confidentiality. Your family's privacy will be absolutely protected." "Good," Blackwood said, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'll return Monday afternoon to collect the journal. And Ms. Parker, I'll be very interested to hear your assessment of the historical significance of my great-grandfather's writing. I suspect you'll find his notation methods particularly fascinating." After Blackwood left, locking the shop door behind him, Amelia stood alone in her workroom, holding the journal and trying to process what had just occurred. The man's parting comment about notation methods had been delivered with an emphasis that suggested hidden meaning, and his insistence on discretion seemed excessive for a routine restoration project. She opened the journal carefully and began examining the pages more systematically. What she found confirmed her initial suspicions and added several new concerns. The handwriting was indeed period appropriate, and much of the content appeared to be genuine diary entries from someone living in the 1870s. But scattered throughout the journal, in margins and between lines of text, were annotations that definitely didn't belong to the 19th century. The modern additions were subtle, so subtle that most people would have dismissed them as random marks or stains if they noticed them at all. But Amelia's trained eye immediately recognized them as deliberate, sequences of numbers and letters that appeared to be randomly distributed, but followed patterns that suggested systematic encoding. This wasn't the work of a casual note-taker or someone adding family genealogy information to an old journal. This was sophisticated cryptographic work disguised to look like historical annotation. Working late into the night, using skills she hadn't employed in 15 years, Amelia began the delicate process of analyzing the hidden codes. The encryption was complex, far more sophisticated than anything that should have appeared in a journal from the 1870s, but also more advanced than most contemporary systems she had encountered during her cybersecurity career. Whoever had created these codes understood both historical and modern cryptographic techniques, and they had gone to considerable effort to make their work invisible to casual observation. The breakthrough came at nearly 3 o'clock in the morning. One sequence of seemingly random numbers, when subjected to a decryption algorithm based on contemporary mathematical principles, resolved into a series of GPS coordinates. The locations were all in Seattle, and when Amelia plotted them on a map, they corresponded to critical infrastructure sites: the main electrical substation for downtown Seattle, the central hub for the city's traffic management system, the primary data center for emergency services communications, and the water treatment facility that served nearly half the metropolitan area. As she continued working through the codes, a pattern of devastating clarity began to emerge. The journal contained detailed plans for a coordinated cyber attack on Seattle's infrastructure systems. Traffic lights would be manipulated to cause maximum chaos during rush hour, disrupting emergency response and creating opportunities for other aspects of the attack. The electrical grid would suffer carefully timed failures that would cascade through the system, leaving hospitals and emergency services without backup power. Water treatment systems would be compromised, potentially affecting the safety of drinking water for hundreds of thousands of people. But the most chilling discovery was the timeline embedded in the coded messages. According to the information hidden in the journal, the attack was scheduled to commence on Friday afternoon, in exactly 4 days. And the digital signature at the end of each coded message identified the operations coordinator, M. Blackwood, Apex Technologies. Amelia sat back in her chair as the full scope of what she had discovered became clear. Marcus Blackwood wasn't just planning a cyber attack. He was planning to use his company's legitimate access to Seattle's infrastructure systems to carry out what amounted to domestic terrorism. Apex Technologies' contracts gave them authorized access to the very systems they were planning to attack, making detection nearly impossible and providing perfect cover for the operation. The implications were staggering. If the attack succeeded, the chaos would be immense. Hospitals would lose power during critical procedures, emergency services would be unable to respond to calls for help, and the transportation system would be paralyzed at exactly the moment when evacuation might be necessary. The death toll could reach into the thousands, and the economic damage would be catastrophic. But there was another layer to the conspiracy that made Amelia's blood run cold. Hidden among the operational details were references to similar attacks planned for other cities: Portland, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Phoenix. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a coordinated campaign that would cripple infrastructure across the entire western United States. For the first time in 15 years, Dr. Amelia Chen began to emerge from the carefully constructed identity of Amelia Parker, the quiet bookbinder. The skills that had made her one of the world's most respected cybersecurity experts were still intact, and the moral imperative that had driven her to expose cyber shield technologies was reasserting itself with overwhelming force. She faced a terrible choice. Exposing Blackwood's plan would require revealing her true identity and risking everything she had built during 15 years of careful anonymity. The same forces that had destroyed her career and driven her into exile might still be active, and stepping back into the light would make her a target once again. But if she remained silent, thousands of innocent people would die. The decision, when it came, wasn't really a choice at all. She had spent 15 years learning to live with the consequences of standing up for what was right. She wasn't about to abandon those principles now, especially when the stakes were higher than they had ever been. Dr. Amelia Chen was about to return from the dead. The next morning brought a deceptively normal Seattle day. Overcast skies, light drizzle, and the familiar rhythm of commuters making their way through Capitol Hill's narrow streets. Amelia opened her shop at the usual time, made coffee from her regular supply of locally roasted beans, and settled into what appeared to be routine work on Marcus Blackwood's journal. To any casual observer, she was simply a middle-aged bookbinder following her established daily routine. But beneath the surface, Dr. Amelia Chen was systematically applying 15 years of accumulated cybersecurity expertise to the most dangerous investigation of her career. The journal lay open on her workbench, its pages revealing secrets that grew more alarming with each decoded message. She had spent the early morning hours verifying her initial analysis, and every additional detail confirmed her worst fears about the scope and sophistication of the planned attack. The cryptographic techniques embedded in the journal were military-grade, the kind of encryption typically used by intelligence agencies for protecting classified communications. The fact that Marcus Blackwood had access to such sophisticated tools suggested either extensive training in covert operations or connections to individuals with such training. Either possibility raised disturbing questions about who was really behind the conspiracy and what resources they might have at their disposal. More troubling still were the operational details that emerged as she worked through the coded messages. The attack plan demonstrated intimate knowledge of Seattle's infrastructure systems that went far beyond what Apex Technologies should have possessed through their legitimate contracts. Someone had conducted extensive reconnaissance of critical facilities, identifying vulnerabilities that weren't documented in any public records, and developing exploitation techniques that suggested direct access to system specifications and security protocols. The water treatment facility attack, in particular, revealed a level of technical knowledge that alarmed her. The coded instructions described specific SCADA system vulnerabilities that were known to only a handful of cybersecurity professionals, and the planned exploitation method would not only disrupt water service, but potentially introduce contaminants that could poison the water supply for days or weeks. This wasn't just terrorism. It was a plan to cause mass casualties through environmental warfare. As Amelia worked, she also began developing a broader understanding of the conspiracy's structure. References buried in the coded messages suggested a hierarchical organization with multiple cells operating independently but coordinating through encrypted communications. The Seattle operation was just one component of a larger campaign that extended across the western United States and possibly beyond. But the most disturbing discovery came when she decoded a series of messages that appeared to discuss financial arrangements. The attack wasn't being carried out by ideological extremists or foreign agents seeking to damage American infrastructure. It was a commercial operation designed to generate profit through carefully orchestrated chaos. The plan was diabolically clever in its simplicity. After the coordinated attacks crippled infrastructure across multiple cities, Apex Technologies and their partner companies would step forward as the solution to the crisis. Their emergency response capabilities would be contracted at premium rates to restore services, implement new security measures, and prevent future attacks. The same people who had caused the crisis would profit enormously from fixing it, while positioning themselves as heroes who had saved American cities from terrorist attacks. The financial projections embedded in the coded messages suggested the conspiracy expected to generate over $2 billion in revenue from emergency contracts in the first year alone, with additional profits coming from long-term maintenance and security agreements that could be worth tens of billions over the following decade. It was disaster capitalism taken to its logical extreme, creating disasters in order to profit from the recovery. Amelia realized she was dealing with something far more complex and dangerous than simple terrorism. This was a sophisticated business operation that happened to use mass casualties and infrastructure destruction as marketing tools. The people behind it weren't fanatics driven by ideology. They were rational actors motivated by profit and perfectly willing to kill thousands of people to advance their financial interests. The psychological profile that emerged from the coded messages was particularly chilling. The planners discussed potential casualty figures with the same dispassionate analysis that corporate executives might use to evaluate market penetration rates. Hospitals losing power during surgical procedures weren't human tragedies. They were acceptable losses that would increase public demand for improved security services. Traffic accidents caused by compromised signal systems weren't deaths. They were market creation events that would drive demand for emergency response contracts. By noon, Amelia had decoded enough material to understand that she was facing an adversary unlike any she had encountered during her cybersecurity career. The combination of technical sophistication, financial resources, and moral flexibility made this conspiracy extraordinarily dangerous, and the 4-day timeline until the planned attack left virtually no margin for error. She began developing a comprehensive intelligence picture, using techniques she had learned during her work with law enforcement agencies 15 years earlier. The first step was verification, confirming that the information in the coded messages was accurate and that the planned attacks were technically feasible given the resources and access that Marcus Blackwood's organization appeared to possess. Using her secure computer system, carefully routed through multiple layers of anonymization to prevent detection, Amelia began probing the digital infrastructure that would be targeted in the attack. What she found confirmed her worst fears. Apex Technologies' legitimate contracts had given them deep access to Seattle's critical systems, and that access had been systematically expanded through techniques that were technically legal but ethically questionable. The traffic management system, for example, was supposed to be isolated from external networks for security reasons. But Apex had convinced city officials to allow monitoring connections that would enable them to provide better maintenance services. Those connections, which appeared benign in the original contract language, actually provided comprehensive access to the system's control mechanisms. With the right credentials, which the coded messages suggested they possessed, Apex could manipulate traffic lights throughout the city with surgical precision. Similar patterns appeared in every system she examined. Legitimate maintenance contracts had been leveraged into comprehensive access. Security protocols had been weakened through carefully crafted change requests, and backup systems had been modified in ways that would actually amplify the impact of the planned attacks, rather than providing fail-safe protection. The scope of the infiltration was breathtaking in its audacity. Over a period of several years, Blackwood's organization had systematically compromised virtually every critical system in Seattle, creating a digital weapon of unprecedented destructive potential. The planned Friday attack would simply activate capabilities that were already in place, like detonating a bomb that had been carefully assembled over months of preparation. As disturbing as the technical analysis was, the human intelligence aspect was even more alarming. The coded messages included references to accomplices within city government, law enforcement, and federal agencies. The conspiracy had clearly invested significant resources in corrupting key officials who could either facilitate the attacks or impede any investigation that might follow. One message, partially decoded but still partially encrypted, appeared to reference our friends in the FBI field office and suggested that certain federal agents were either being paid to ignore warning signs or actively participating in the conspiracy. Another message discussed political cover that would be provided by unnamed individuals in Washington, D.C., implying that the conspiracy had reached into the highest levels of government. The realization that she couldn't simply contact federal authorities and expect immediate, uncorrupted assistance was terrifying. Dr. Amelia Chen had learned 15 years ago that corruption could extend far beyond the organizations where it originated, but the scope of the infiltration suggested by the coded messages was unprecedented in her experience. This meant that any response to the conspiracy would have to be carefully planned to avoid corrupt officials who might warn Blackwood or actively sabotage any intervention. She would need to identify trustworthy individuals within law enforcement, gather irrefutable evidence that couldn't be suppressed or discredited, and coordinate a response that could succeed despite the possibility of internal opposition. The afternoon brought an unexpected complication that added urgency to her already desperate timeline. Marcus Blackwood called her shop at exactly 2 p.m., his voice carrying a level of tension that hadn't been present during his visit the previous day. "Ms. Parker, I wanted to check on the progress of my journal restoration," he said, though something in his tone suggested this wasn't a routine customer service call. "The work is proceeding on schedule," Amelia replied carefully. "I've completed the initial assessment and begun the stabilization process for the damaged pages. The project should be completed by Monday, as we discussed." "Actually, I've been thinking about our timeline," Blackwood said. "I may need the journal returned earlier than planned. Would it be possible to have it ready by Saturday morning instead of Monday afternoon?" The request sent alarm bells ringing in Amelia's mind. Blackwood had originally insisted on a Friday deadline, then grudgingly accepted Monday when she refused to compromise on quality. Now he was pushing the deadline forward again, but his tone suggested something more than simple impatience. There was an urgency that hadn't been present before, as if something had changed that made retrieving the journal more critical. "Saturday would be quite challenging," she said, stalling for time while she tried to understand what might have prompted this change. The restoration work is at a delicate stage, and rushing the process could damage the journal's historical integrity. "I understand your concerns," Blackwood replied, "but this is quite important. I'd be willing to pay a substantial rush fee to have the work completed by Saturday morning. Money is no object if you can accommodate this request." The offer of unlimited payment for rushed work was another red flag. In her experience, people who claimed that money was no object were usually trying to buy something other than the stated service. Blackwood wasn't just interested in getting his journal back. He was trying to recover it before something happened that would make its contents dangerous to possess. "Let me see what I can do," Amelia said. "I'll work on it this evening and call you tomorrow to confirm whether Saturday is feasible." "Thank you," Blackwood said, though his voice carried a note of barely concealed relief. "I'll be available to take your call at any time tomorrow. This really is quite important to me." After ending the call, Amelia sat in her shop trying to decode the subtext of their conversation. Blackwood's sudden urgency suggested that something had changed in the 4-day timeline until the planned attack. Either the schedule was being accelerated, or he had reason to believe that the journal's contents might be discovered before Friday. The possibility that her investigation had been detected was terrifying, but seemed unlikely. She had been extremely careful to avoid leaving digital footprints that could be traced back to her, and her analysis of the coded messages had been conducted using offline systems that weren't connected to any networks. Unless Blackwood had sophisticated surveillance equipment monitoring her shop, which was possible, but would require resources and planning that seemed excessive for a routine customer interaction. There was no obvious way he could know about her activities. More likely, something had happened within the conspiracy that was causing Blackwood to accelerate his timeline or eliminate evidence that could be used against him. Perhaps other members of the organization were having second thoughts about the operation, or law enforcement had detected some aspect of the planned attacks through independent investigation. Whatever the reason, the shortened timeline meant that she had even less time to develop a response to the conspiracy. If Blackwood was planning to retrieve the journal on Saturday, she had less than 48 hours to complete her analysis, identify trustworthy law enforcement contacts, and coordinate whatever intervention might be possible. The rest of the afternoon was spent in intensive analysis of the remaining coded messages, looking for any information that might help her understand the conspiracy's current status or identify vulnerabilities that could be exploited to prevent the attack. What she found painted an increasingly alarming picture of an organization that had anticipated the possibility of discovery and developed contingency plans for dealing with threats to their operation. One series of messages discussed cleanup protocols that would be implemented if the conspiracy was exposed before the planned attacks. These protocols included the elimination of potential witnesses, the destruction of evidence, and the activation of insurance policies that would ensure key conspirators could escape prosecution. The clinical language used to describe these measures left no doubt that the organization was prepared to kill anyone who threatened their operation, including law enforcement officers and government officials. Another set of coded messages revealed that the conspiracy had identified and infiltrated local law enforcement agencies, federal field offices, and regulatory agencies that might be involved in investigating or preventing infrastructure attacks. The level of penetration was staggering. They had sources within the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, the Seattle Police Department, and even the mayor's office. Any conventional attempt to report the conspiracy through official channels would likely be detected and neutralized before it could pose a threat to their operation. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was a reference to Project Reset, which appeared to be a backup plan that would be implemented if the primary attack scenario became unfeasible. The coded messages were fragmentary and difficult to decode, but they suggested an alternative approach that would be even more destructive than the infrastructure attacks they were planning for Friday. The details were limited, but Project Reset appeared to involve direct attacks on populated areas rather than infrastructure systems. References to high-value targets and maximum psychological impact suggested that the backup plan might involve conventional terrorism, bombs, chemical weapons, or other direct attacks that would cause immediate mass casualties rather than the slower developing crisis that would result from infrastructure failure. The existence of Project Reset added another layer of urgency to her situation. Even if she could successfully prevent the infrastructure attacks scheduled for Friday, doing so might trigger an even more deadly alternative that could kill thousands of people with little or no warning. As evening approached, Amelia realized that she was facing a problem that exceeded her individual capabilities. The conspiracy was too large, too well connected, and too sophisticated to be exposed or stopped by a single person, no matter how skilled. She needed help, but identifying trustworthy allies would require extreme care to avoid accidentally approaching someone who was part of the conspiracy or who might inadvertently alert them to her investigation. The solution, when it came to her, was both obvious and terrifying. She would have to contact Marcus Wong, the only person who knew her true identity and had the resources and connections necessary to coordinate a response to the conspiracy. But reaching out to Marcus would mean abandoning the anonymity she had carefully maintained for 15 years and accepting the risk that exposure might lead to her death. The encrypted communication system she used to contact Marcus hadn't been activated in over 3 years. Their last exchange had been a brief message confirming that she was safe and didn't need assistance, part of an annual check-in routine they had established to ensure that neither of them had been compromised or coerced. Using the system now would signal that she was facing a crisis that exceeded her ability to handle alone. The message she composed was necessarily brief and cryptic, since even their secure communication channel could potentially be monitored by sufficiently sophisticated adversaries. Package requires immediate authentication. Historical documents contain contemporary annotations of significant concern. Professional consultation needed within 24 hours. Security protocols suggest expanded verification necessary. Marcus would understand the coded language. Package requires authentication meant that she had discovered something that required verification by someone with appropriate expertise. Historical documents contain contemporary annotations, indicated that she had found evidence of current criminal activity, disguised as something innocent. Professional consultation was their code for requesting assistance that might require his skills as a security consultant. And expanded verification meant that the threat was significant enough to potentially require law enforcement involvement. After sending the message, Amelia began preparing for what might be her last night of anonymity. She packed the most critical evidence from her investigation of the journal into encrypted files that could be transmitted quickly if necessary. She prepared backup copies of everything and stored them in secure locations that Marcus could access if something happened to her. And she began planning for the possibility that her carefully constructed life as Amelia Parker might end within the next few days. The response from Marcus came within 2 hours, faster than she had expected, but not fast enough to calm her growing anxiety. Authentication confirmed. Historical annotations verified as contemporary threat. Professional consultation authorized. Recommend immediate relocation to secure facility. Transportation arranged for 0600 tomorrow. Standard protocols in effect. Marcus was taking her warnings seriously, which was both reassuring and terrifying. His reference to immediate relocation meant that he believed the threat was significant enough to justify extracting her from Seattle entirely. Transportation arranged indicated that he was activating resources he normally kept in reserve for extreme situations. And standard protocols was their code for the comprehensive security measures they had developed during her transition from Dr. Amelia Chen to Amelia Parker 15 years ago. She had 6 hours to prepare for extraction and the end of her life as a Seattle bookbinder. The secure facility turned out to be a nondescript office building in Bellevue, chosen specifically for its unremarkable appearance and sophisticated electronic countermeasures. Marcus Wong met her in the underground garage at exactly 6 a.m., his familiar face showing 15 years of aging, but retaining the sharp intelligence that had made him one of the military's most effective intelligence officers. At 55, Marcus carried himself with the controlled precision of someone who had spent decades in high-stakes situations. His dark hair was now streaked with silver, and lines around his eyes spoke of years spent analyzing threats and developing responses to dangers that most people never imagined. But his handshake was firm, his smile genuine, and his presence immediately made Amelia feel less isolated than she had felt in years. "Dr. Chen," he said quietly as they entered a service elevator, "it's good to see you again, though I wish the circumstances were different." "It's been Amelia Parker for 15 years, she replied. "I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to hear my real name." You may need to get used to hearing it again, Marcus said, as the elevator rose to the building's 7th floor. Based on your message and the preliminary research I've conducted since receiving it, we're dealing with something that's going to require your full expertise as Dr. Amelia Chen. The secure facility occupied the entire 7th floor, though from the outside it appeared to be ordinary office space leased by a company called Pacific Consulting Services. In reality, it was one of several safe houses that Marcus maintained for clients who required protection during sensitive investigations or who needed to disappear from public view while threats were being neutralized. The main conference room was equipped with multiple monitors, secure communication systems, and analysis equipment that rivaled what Amelia had used during her cybersecurity career. Marcus had clearly prepared for an intensive briefing session, with documents and digital files arranged for systematic review. Before we begin, Marcus said, I need to confirm something that I've suspected for years but never asked directly. Are you ready to be Dr. Amelia Chen again, knowing that it will mean the end of your anonymity and possibly your life as Amelia Parker? The question hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of 15 years of careful construction and the prospect of losing everything she had built in Seattle. The apartment above the bookbinding shop, the relationships with neighbors and customers, the quiet satisfaction of restoring damaged books. All of it would be gone if she stepped back into her original identity. Yes, she said without hesitation. What I've discovered is too important to protect my anonymity. Thousands of people are going to die if this conspiracy succeeds. Marcus nodded approvingly. Then let's see what you've found. For the next 3 hours, Amelia walked Marcus through every detail of her analysis of the coded messages hidden in Marcus Blackwood's journal. She showed him the decryption techniques she had used, the infrastructure vulnerabilities that had been identified, the financial arrangements that motivated the conspiracy, and the timeline that led to Friday's planned attack. Marcus listened with the focused attention of someone trained to absorb complex information quickly, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly allowing her to present the complete picture before offering his assessment. His expression grew increasingly grim as the scope of the conspiracy became clear, and by the time she finished her presentation, he was leaning back in his chair with the look of someone who had just learned that his worst fears were understated. This is worse than I expected, he said finally. And I had already concluded that it was going to be bad based on your initial message. How much worse? Amelia asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Marcus activated one of the monitors and began displaying information he had gathered during his preliminary investigation. I spent yesterday evening running background checks on Marcus Blackwood and Apex Technologies. What I found suggests that your discovery is just the tip of a much larger iceberg. The screen showed a complex organizational chart that connected Apex Technologies to dozens of other companies across the United States and internationally. The connections weren't obvious. They were hidden behind shell corporations, private equity firms, and partnership agreements that would require extensive investigation to uncover. But the pattern that emerged suggested a coordinated network of companies that had systematically infiltrated critical infrastructure systems across multiple countries. Blackwood isn't just planning attacks on Seattle, Marcus explained. He's part of an international organization that has been positioning itself to exploit infrastructure vulnerabilities for at least a decade. The attacks you discovered are scheduled to be coordinated with similar operations in Europe, Asia, and South America. How is that possible? Amelia asked. The level of coordination and resources required would be enormous. That's where it gets interesting, Marcus said, switching to another screen that showed financial records and corporate ownership structures. The organization behind this isn't a traditional terrorist group or criminal enterprise. It's a consortium of private military contractors, cybersecurity companies, and infrastructure management firms that have been consolidating control over critical systems while positioning themselves to profit from the chaos they create. The financial analysis that Marcus had compiled was staggering in its scope. The consortium controlled companies that managed electrical grids in 12 countries, water treatment facilities in major cities across 4 continents, and telecommunications infrastructure that carried a significant percentage of global internet traffic. They had also acquired private military contractors that specialized in emergency response and disaster recovery, positioning themselves to profit enormously when the infrastructure they controlled suffered attacks that they had actually orchestrated themselves. It's disaster capitalism taken to a global scale, Amelia said, finally understanding the true magnitude of what she had stumbled into. Exactly, Marcus confirmed. And the beauty of their approach is that they're not actually breaking any laws until the moment they activate their attack plans. All of their infiltration of infrastructure systems has been accomplished through legitimate business transactions and legal contracts. They've essentially purchased the right to destroy civilization and then profit from rebuilding it. The implications were overwhelming. This wasn't just about preventing attacks on Seattle's infrastructure. It was about exposing and dismantling a global conspiracy that threatened the basic functioning of modern society. The coded messages in Blackwood's journal weren't just evidence of local terrorism. They were proof of an international criminal enterprise that had been years in the making. But the most disturbing revelation came when Marcus showed her intelligence reports that suggested similar conspiracies had already been successful in other locations. Several recent infrastructure failures that had been attributed to aging equipment, natural disasters, or foreign cyber attacks were actually documented in the consortium's internal communications as successful market creation events. The massive power outage that had crippled parts of the eastern United States 2 years earlier, causing dozens of deaths and billions of dollars in economic damage, had actually been orchestrated by consortium members who then received lucrative contracts to prevent future failures. A water treatment crisis in Europe that had sickened thousands of people had been caused by deliberate sabotage, followed by highly profitable emergency response contracts awarded to consortium companies. How many people have already died because of this conspiracy? Amelia asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Hundreds, possibly thousands, Marcus replied grimly. And that's just the directly attributable deaths. The economic disruption and social chaos caused by their operations have probably had cascading effects that killed many more people indirectly. The moral weight of what they were facing settled over both of them like a suffocating blanket. They weren't just trying to prevent a future attack. They were trying to expose and stop an ongoing series of attacks that had been disguised as natural disasters and system failures for years. What do we do? Amelia asked. The timeline until Friday's attack is too short for conventional law enforcement response, and you've shown me that the conspiracy has infiltrated agencies that would normally handle this kind of threat. Marcus switched to another screen, this one showing a network diagram of trustworthy contacts he had identified within various agencies. We're going to do what you tried to do 15 years ago, but this time we're going to do it right. We're going to gather irrefutable evidence, identify clean channels for reporting it, and coordinate a response that can't be suppressed or discredited. How is this time going to be different? Amelia asked. The conspiracy is larger and more sophisticated than anything I faced with CyberShield technologies. Because this time, you're not working alone, Marcus replied. And because 15 years of experience has taught us how to identify and avoid the corruption that destroyed your first attempt to expose this kind of conspiracy. Marcus explained that he had spent years building a network of contacts within law enforcement, intelligence agencies, and regulatory organizations. people whose integrity had been tested through multiple operations and who had proven themselves capable of acting independently when their agencies were compromised. These contacts were positioned to receive evidence and coordinate responses even if the primary channels of authority were corrupted. More importantly, he had developed techniques for generating and disseminating evidence that couldn't be suppressed or discredited. The approach involved simultaneously providing information to multiple independent organizations, law enforcement agencies, investigative journalists, regulatory bodies, and international monitoring organizations, in a coordinated manner that would make it impossible for the conspiracy to contain the exposure. The key is overwhelming their ability to control the narrative, Marcus explained. They can suppress evidence if it's reported through a single channel, corrupt officials if only one agency is involved, and discredit witnesses if there's only one source of information. But they can't simultaneously suppress evidence reported to 20 different organizations in 6 different countries, especially if the evidence is technically sophisticated enough to be verified independently. The plan that Marcus outlined was ambitious and dangerous. They would spend the next 2 days gathering additional evidence to supplement what Amelia had already discovered, identifying specific individuals within the conspiracy who could be arrested immediately, and coordinating with international partners who could simultaneously expose the global aspects of the operation. Then, on Thursday evening, less than 24 hours before the planned Friday attack, they would simultaneously release everything to law enforcement agencies, regulatory bodies, and news organizations around the world. The evidence would be comprehensive enough to prove the conspiracy's existence, specific enough to enable immediate arrests, and distributed widely enough to prevent suppression. "What about Blackwood's journal?" Amelia asked. "He's expecting to collect it on Saturday, and the coded messages are our primary evidence." "That's where your expertise as a bookbinder becomes crucial," Marcus said with a slight smile. "You're going to complete the restoration exactly as requested, but you're also going to create perfect copies of every page that contains coded messages. Blackwood will get his journal back, but we'll retain all the evidence we need." The technical challenges involved in creating undetectable copies of 19th century paper and ink were significant. But Amelia had developed exactly those skills during her 15 years as a book restorer. She could forge historical documents well enough to fool experts, and the copies would be indistinguishable from the originals unless subjected to sophisticated laboratory analysis. But there was another aspect of their plan that made her nervous. "What happens to me after we expose the conspiracy? They've already proven they're willing to kill people to protect their operation." Marcus's expression grew serious. "That's the other reason I wanted to extract you from Seattle. Once we activate this plan, you'll be in immediate danger until the key conspirators are arrested. We'll need to keep you in protective custody, probably under federal witness protection, until the trials are concluded." "How long could that take?" "Years," Marcus admitted. "This conspiracy involves hundreds of people across multiple countries. The legal proceedings will be complex and lengthy, and you'll be a primary witness in most of them." The realization that her quiet life as Amelia Parker was ending forever was both liberating and terrifying. She had spent 15 years building a new identity and finding satisfaction in work that had nothing to do with her former expertise. But the discovery of Blackwood's conspiracy had made it impossible to remain hidden, and she was discovering that she had missed the intellectual challenge and moral clarity of her original career. "There's something else you should know," Marcus said, his tone becoming even more serious. "My preliminary investigation suggests that the conspiracy that destroyed your career 15 years ago and this current operation are connected. Some of the same people who were involved in framing you for CyberShield's crimes are also connected to Blackwood's organization." The news hit Amelia like a physical blow. She had always suspected that the corruption at CyberShield was part of something larger, but she had assumed that the people responsible had moved on to other opportunities. The possibility that they were still active and had spent the intervening years building an even more dangerous criminal enterprise was both infuriating and terrifying. "Who?" she asked. Marcus displayed a photograph on one of the monitors, a man in his early 60s with silver hair and the kind of expensive suit that suggested high-level corporate or government employment. Vincent Morrison, formerly of CyberShield Technologies, currently Chief Technology Officer of Meridian Infrastructure Solutions. Meridian is one of the primary companies in Blackwood's consortium. Amelia recognized the name immediately. Vincent Morrison had been her direct superior at CyberShield and one of the key figures in orchestrating her downfall. He had provided much of the falsified evidence that suggested she was selling classified information, and his testimony during the congressional hearings had been crucial in establishing the narrative that portrayed her as a traitor rather than a whistleblower. "He's been building this conspiracy for 15 years, she said, understanding finally dawning. "My exposure of CyberShield didn't stop their operation. It just forced them to be more careful and more ambitious." "That's my assessment as well," Marcus confirmed. "And it means that exposing this conspiracy isn't just about preventing Friday's attack. It's about finishing what you started 15 years ago and finally bringing down the network that destroyed your career and has been killing innocent people ever since." The personal stakes had just become as high as the public ones. Amelia wasn't just trying to save thousands of lives. She was fighting for the vindication that had been denied to her for 15 years and the opportunity to prove that she had been right all along about the corruption at CyberShield. But first, they had to prevent a coordinated attack that would cripple infrastructure across the western United States and potentially kill thousands of people. The clock was ticking, and they had less than 48 hours to coordinate the most complex counterintelligence operation either of them had ever attempted. The next 36 hours blurred together in a frenzy of coordinated activity that tested every skill Amelia had developed during her cybersecurity career. Marcus's secure facility became a command center where she worked alongside analysts, investigators, and technical specialists who had been carefully selected for their expertise and integrity. The first priority was creating perfect copies of the coded pages from Blackwood's journal. This required not only reproducing the original 19th century paper and ink, but also replicating the aging patterns, wear marks, and subtle imperfections that would convince experts of their authenticity. Amelia worked with a team of forensic document specialists who had access to historical materials and specialized equipment that made the forgeries virtually undetectable. Simultaneously, she was expanding her analysis of the coded messages to extract every possible detail about the conspiracy's structure, timeline, and methods. Each new piece of information led to additional investigations that revealed the scope of the network's infiltration into critical systems across the United States and internationally. The breakthrough that changed everything came when she decoded a series of messages that contained detailed personnel records for key conspirators. The files included not only names and contact information, but also psychological profiles, financial arrangements, and security protocols that the conspiracy used to maintain operational security and ensure loyalty among its members. One name that appeared repeatedly in the decoded messages made Marcus's face go pale when she showed it to him. Deputy Director Sarah Hendricks of the FBI's Cybercrime Division. Hendricks was not only aware of the conspiracy, she was actively participating in it, using her position to suppress investigations and protect key figures from law enforcement scrutiny. This explains why several of my contacts in federal law enforcement have been reporting unusual obstacles to infrastructure security investigations, Marcus said grimly. Hendricks has been sabotaging them from within. The presence of high-level FBI officials in the conspiracy meant that conventional reporting channels were completely compromised. Any attempt to alert federal authorities through normal procedures would likely result in the evidence being suppressed and the investigators being targeted for elimination. But Marcus had anticipated this possibility and developed alternative approaches that bypassed the corrupted official channels entirely. His network included journalists who specialized in investigating government corruption, international law enforcement contacts who could coordinate responses outside U.S. jurisdiction, and military intelligence officers who operated independently of civilian authority structures. We're going to use what I call the overwhelming revelation strategy, Marcus explained as they prepared their evidence packages. Instead of trying to work within compromised systems, we're going to simultaneously expose the conspiracy to so many different organizations that they can't possibly suppress all of them. The evidence packages they prepared were comprehensive and damning. Each one contained not only the decoded messages from Blackwood's journal, but also supporting documentation that Marcus's team had gathered through independent investigation. Financial records showed the movement of money between consortium companies and the personal accounts of corrupted officials. Communication logs revealed coordination between conspirators in different countries. Technical analysis proved that recent infrastructure failures had been deliberately caused rather than accidental. Most importantly, the evidence packages included specific, actionable intelligence that would enable immediate response. Names and addresses of key conspirators, locations of critical facilities that were being targeted, detailed timelines of planned attacks, and technical specifications for the methods that would be used to compromise infrastructure systems. By Wednesday evening, they had prepared evidence packages for delivery to 47 different organizations in 12 countries. Law enforcement agencies would receive versions tailored to enable immediate arrests and prevention of the Friday attacks. Regulatory bodies would get information focused on the systematic violations of infrastructure security requirements. Journalists would receive packages that emphasized the human impact and political implications of the conspiracy. International partners would get intelligence that enabled them to identify and neutralize the global aspects of the network. The coordination required to deliver all of these packages simultaneously was staggering in its complexity. Marcus had activated contacts around the world, each with specific instructions about timing and procedures that would ensure maximum impact while preventing the conspiracy from detecting the exposure until it was too late to respond effectively. At exactly 8 p.m. Pacific time tomorrow, Marcus explained as they reviewed the final plans, 47 people in 12 countries are going to simultaneously receive evidence of the largest infrastructure conspiracy in modern history. By 8:30, law enforcement agencies will be conducting coordinated arrests in 6 countries. By 9 a.m., news organizations will be broadcasting the story globally. And by 9:30, regulatory agencies will be implementing emergency security protocols that will protect critical infrastructure from the planned attacks. The plan was elegant in its coordination and comprehensive in its scope. But Amelia knew that the most dangerous period would be the hours immediately following the revelation, when the conspiracy would realize they had been exposed and would likely activate their most desperate countermeasures. "What about Project Reset?" she asked. "The backup plan that would involve direct attacks on populated areas if the infrastructure operation fails?" Marcus's expression darkened. "That's the wild card that worries me most. We've identified some of the resources they've assembled for conventional terrorist attacks, but the intelligence is fragmentary. If they decide to activate Project Reset in response to our exposure, they could still kill hundreds or thousands of people before we can stop them." The possibility that their success in preventing the infrastructure attacks might trigger an even more deadly response added another layer of urgency to their timeline. They needed to not only expose the conspiracy and prevent Friday's planned attacks, but also anticipate and counter whatever desperate measures the conspirators might take when they realized their operation had been compromised. Thursday morning brought the most stressful day of Amelia's life since her original exposure of CyberShield technologies. She returned to her bookbinding shop under heavy but discreet security provided by Marcus's team to complete the restoration of Blackwood's journal and prepare for what would likely be her final interaction with the man who had unknowingly provided her with the evidence to destroy his entire operation. The technical work of creating perfect copies of the coded pages was meticulous and time-consuming, requiring her to apply 15 years of expertise in historical document restoration to create forgeries that would withstand casual examination. Each page had to be photographed under multiple lighting conditions to capture every detail of the original, then reproduced using period-appropriate materials and techniques that matched the aging patterns of genuine 19th century paper. The original journal would be returned to Blackwood exactly as requested, with the coded messages intact, but photographed and analyzed in detail. The copies would be retained as evidence and distributed to law enforcement agencies as part of the coordinated revelation scheduled for that evening. As she worked, Amelia found herself thinking about the extraordinary series of coincidences that had brought her to this moment. If Blackwood had chosen any other bookbinder in Seattle, his coded messages would never have been discovered. If she had been anyone other than Dr. Amelia Chen, she would never have possessed the expertise necessary to decode them. If Marcus Wong hadn't maintained their secure communication system for 15 years, she would never have been able to coordinate a response. But perhaps most importantly, if she hadn't spent 15 years learning to live with the consequences of standing up for what was right, she might not have had the courage to risk everything again when the stakes were even higher than they had been the first time. The call from Blackwood came at exactly 2 p.m., his voice carrying a level of tension that suggested he was under significant stress. "Ms. Parker, I wanted to confirm that the journal will be ready for pickup tomorrow morning as we discussed." "Yes, Mr. Blackwood," Amelia replied, keeping her voice steady despite the knowledge that she was speaking to someone who planned to kill thousands of people within 24 hours. "The restoration has been completed, and the journal is ready for return. I think you'll be very pleased with the results." "Excellent," Blackwood said, though she could hear something in his tone that suggested he was distracted by other concerns. "I'll be there at 9 a.m. sharp to collect it. And Miss Parker, I want to emphasize again how important it is that our transaction remain completely confidential. Family privacy is crucial in matters like this." "Of course," Amelia replied. "Client confidentiality is always absolute in my work." After ending the call, she realized that Blackwood had inadvertently provided her with additional intelligence about the conspiracy's current status. His increased emphasis on secrecy and his obvious stress suggested that something within the organization was causing concern. Perhaps other conspirators were having second thoughts about the operation, or law enforcement had detected some aspect of their preparation that was making them nervous. Either way, the signs suggested that the conspiracy was becoming unstable, which made their coordinated exposure even more critical. If Blackwood's organization was beginning to fragment under stress, the coordinated revelation planned for that evening might catch them at exactly the right moment to prevent both the infrastructure attacks and any backup plans they might have prepared. The afternoon was spent in final preparations for what Marcus had dubbed Operation Revelation. Evidence packages were prepared for final distribution, international contacts confirmed their readiness to act, and security arrangements were finalized to protect key witnesses and investigators during the critical hours when the conspiracy would be most dangerous. At 6 p.m., Amelia left her bookbinding shop for what she knew would be the last time. Marcus's security team would maintain surveillance of the location in case Blackwood or his associates attempted to retrieve the journal early or investigate her activities. But she would never again live as Amelia Parker, the quiet bookbinder who had spent 15 years restoring damaged books in Seattle's Capitol Hill district. The secure facility in Bellevue had been transformed into a command center that rivaled anything she had seen during her cybersecurity career. Multiple screens displayed real-time intelligence from around the world. Secure communication systems connected them to law enforcement and intelligence agencies in 12 countries, and technical specialists monitored the status of critical infrastructure systems that would be targeted in the planned attacks. At exactly 7:45 p.m., Marcus gave the final authorization for Operation Revelation to commence. Around the world, his carefully selected contacts began receiving evidence packages that would expose the largest infrastructure conspiracy in modern history. The coordinated revelation was designed to occur simultaneously across multiple time zones, ensuring that the conspiracy's leaders would be unable to coordinate an effective response before law enforcement agencies could act. The first confirmation came from London, where investigators from Scotland Yard were already moving to arrest 3 British citizens identified in the decoded messages as key coordinators for European operations. Within minutes, similar confirmations arrived from law enforcement agencies in France, Germany, Japan, and Australia. But the most critical operations were occurring in the United States, where FBI agents, carefully selected for their integrity and independence from corrupted officials like Deputy Director Hendricks, were conducting simultaneous raids on Apex Technologies facilities in Seattle, Phoenix, and Los Angeles. At 8:15 p.m., the first news reports began appearing on international media outlets. The story was too large and too well documented for any individual organization to suppress, and the simultaneous revelation in multiple countries made it impossible for the conspiracy to control the narrative or discredit the evidence. By 8:30 p.m., Marcus Blackwood was in federal custody, arrested at his Seattle home while apparently attempting to destroy computer equipment that contained additional evidence of the conspiracy. Similar arrests were occurring across the United States and internationally, as law enforcement agencies acted on the specific intelligence provided in the evidence packages. But the most satisfying moment for Amelia came when she watched live news footage of Vincent Morrison being arrested at his office in San Francisco. The man who had orchestrated her downfall 15 years earlier was finally facing justice for crimes that extended far beyond the corruption at CyberShield Technologies. However, their success in exposing the conspiracy and preventing the Friday attacks came with an immediate and deadly consequence. At 9:47 p.m., Marcus's monitoring systems detected unusual activity around several locations in Seattle that had been identified in fragmentary intelligence as possible staging areas for Project Reset. "They're activating the backup plan," Marcus said grimly, as reports came in of armed individuals moving toward high-value targets throughout the city. "We prevented the infrastructure attacks, but they're shifting to direct terrorism." The next few hours would determine whether their success in exposing the conspiracy would be overshadowed by the casualties that might result from the desperate measures that surviving conspirators were apparently preparing to implement. The activation of Project Reset transformed Seattle into a battlefield that most of the city's residents never realized existed. While news reports focused on the international arrests and exposure of the infrastructure conspiracy, a deadly game of cat and mouse was playing out across the metropolitan area as surviving conspirators attempted to salvage something from the wreckage of their operation. Marcus's command center became the coordination point for a desperate effort to prevent mass casualties from attacks that were being launched with military precision by people who had nothing left to lose. The decoded intelligence about Project Reset had been fragmentary, but what they knew suggested a series of coordinated strikes against high-value targets, designed to cause maximum psychological impact and demonstrate that the conspiracy retained the capability to inflict devastating casualties even after their primary operation had been exposed. The confrontation was brief but violent. The conspirators were heavily armed and apparently prepared to die rather than be captured, leading to a firefight in the airport parking garage that lasted nearly 20 minutes before all 6 attackers were either killed or subdued. Explosive devices found in their possession confirmed that they had been planning to cause mass casualties, and their equipment was sophisticated enough to have achieved their objectives if they hadn't been intercepted. But the airport attack was apparently just one component of a larger coordinated strike. At 10:47 p.m., similar teams were detected approaching the Seattle Convention Center, where a technology conference was being held with over 3,000 attendees, and CenturyLink Field, where a late-night soccer match was in progress with nearly 40,000 spectators. The scale of the coordinated attack was staggering. If all 3 strikes had succeeded, the casualty count could have reached into the tens of thousands, making it one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in American history. The conspiracy's leaders had apparently decided that if they couldn't profit from their infrastructure operation, they would at least ensure that their exposure came at a devastating cost in human lives. Marcus coordinated the response from his command center, using intelligence gathered from the decoded messages to anticipate the attackers' strategies and direct law enforcement resources to intercept them before they could reach their targets. But the conspirators had clearly spent months preparing for this contingency, and their planning was sophisticated enough to challenge even the most experienced counterterrorism professionals. The attack on the convention center was stopped when FBI snipers eliminated 3 of the 4-person team as they attempted to enter the building through a service entrance. The 4th attacker managed to detonate an explosive device in the loading dock area, causing significant structural damage, but relatively few casualties since most conference attendees were in the main auditorium several floors away. The soccer stadium attack proved more challenging to prevent. The 8-person team assigned to this target had apparently infiltrated the facility's security system in advance, giving them access to areas that should have been protected. They managed to place explosive devices in multiple locations throughout the stadium before being detected, creating a situation where attempting to evacuate 40,000 people might have caused more casualties than the attack itself. The solution came from an unexpected source. Dr. Amelia Chen's expertise in cybersecurity proved crucial when she realized that the stadium's fire suppression system could be remotely activated to flood the areas where explosives had been placed, potentially preventing detonation or at least reducing the effectiveness of the devices. Working with technical specialists at the command center, Amelia hacked into the stadium's environmental control systems and activated sprinkler systems in a coordinated pattern that soaked the explosive devices without triggering panic among the spectators. The attackers, realizing that their plan had been compromised, attempted to detonate their devices manually, but the water damage had rendered most of them inoperable. The confrontation with the stadium attack team was the most intense of the night. The 8 conspirators were heavily armed and positioned throughout the facility, leading to running gun battles in the concourses and service areas, while 40,000 soccer fans remained largely unaware of the deadly drama unfolding around them. It took nearly 2 hours for law enforcement to neutralize all of the attackers, but the final casualty count was remarkably low considering the scale of the planned attack. By 2 a.m., the immediate crisis appeared to be over. The 3 main components of Project Reset had been prevented or minimized, and law enforcement agencies were conducting systematic searches for any additional attack teams that might still be active. The coordinated revelation of the infrastructure conspiracy had been successful beyond their most optimistic projections, with arrests occurring in 6 countries and evidence packages being analyzed by investigators around the world. But the night's events had demonstrated something that neither Amelia nor Marcus had fully anticipated. The conspiracy's capacity for violence when cornered was far greater than they had realized. The people behind the infrastructure plot weren't just sophisticated criminals motivated by profit. They were individuals who were prepared to kill thousands of innocent people rather than accept defeat. As dawn broke over Seattle, the full scope of what they had prevented became clear. In addition to the infrastructure attacks that would have crippled the city's basic services, the conspiracy had prepared backup plans that could have caused casualties on a scale that would have transformed American society. The combination of infrastructure failure and coordinated terrorist attacks would have created a level of chaos and fear that could have justified the kind of authoritarian response that the conspiracy's political allies were apparently prepared to implement. This wasn't just about making money from emergency contracts, Marcus said, as they reviewed the intelligence that had been gathered during the night's operations. This was about creating the kind of crisis that would have enabled a fundamental transformation of American government and society. The political implications of the conspiracy were staggering in their scope. The coded messages had revealed connections between key conspirators and political figures who would have benefited from the fear and chaos that successful attacks would have generated. Emergency powers that would have been granted in response to infrastructure collapse and terrorist attacks would have remained in place indefinitely, creating opportunities for the kind of authoritarian governance that had been implemented in other countries following similar crises. We didn't just prevent terrorist attacks, Amelia realized. We prevented a coup. The investigation that followed would reveal the full extent of the conspiracy's ambitions and the resources they had assembled to achieve them. But in the immediate aftermath of Operation Revelation and the prevention of Project Reset, Amelia found herself facing a question that had been dormant for 15 years. What did she want to do with the rest of her life? Her identity as Amelia Parker, the quiet bookbinder, was no longer viable. The exposure of the conspiracy had necessarily revealed her role in preventing the attacks and her true identity as doctor. Amelia Chen would inevitably become public knowledge as the legal proceedings unfolded. She could enter federal witness protection and disappear again, but the prospect of spending another 15 years hiding from who she really was no longer appealed to her. The alternative was to reclaim her identity as doctor, Amelia Chen, and return to the cybersecurity field that had once been her passion. The skills that had enabled her to decode the conspiracy's messages and coordinate the response to their attacks were desperately needed in a world where critical infrastructure was increasingly vulnerable to exactly the kinds of threats she had just helped to prevent. But there was a third option that she hadn't considered until Marcus suggested it during their debriefing session. Using her unique combination of technical expertise and hard-won wisdom to help train the next generation of cybersecurity professionals who would be responsible for protecting society from similar threats in the future. You've learned something that can't be taught in textbooks or laboratory exercises, Marcus pointed out. You've seen how sophisticated adversaries actually operate, and you understand the human factors that make technical vulnerabilities truly dangerous. That knowledge is invaluable for people who are going to be defending critical infrastructure in an increasingly dangerous world. The idea of teaching appealed to her in ways that surprised her. During her 15 years as a bookbinder, she had discovered a deep satisfaction in preserving knowledge and passing it on to future generations. The prospect of doing something similar in the cybersecurity field, helping to prepare young professionals for the kinds of threats they would face, felt like a natural evolution of both her technical expertise and her personal growth. The first indication of the conspiracy's new strategy came at 10:23 p.m. when security cameras at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport detected a team of 6 individuals approaching the terminal building with equipment that appeared to be sophisticated explosives. The timing was perfect from a terrorist perspective. The airport was crowded with late-night travelers, and an attack would generate massive casualties while creating the kind of spectacular media coverage that would overshadow news reports about the arrests and infrastructure plot. But Marcus's coordination with law enforcement agencies during Operation Revelation had prepared them for exactly this kind of contingency. FBI tactical teams were already positioned around high-value targets throughout the city, and they were able to intercept the airport attack team before they could enter the terminal building. 6 months after Operation Revelation, Dr. Amelia Chen stood in front of a classroom filled with graduate students at the University of Washington's new Institute for Critical Infrastructure Security. The program had been established specifically to address the vulnerabilities that the Blackwood conspiracy had exposed. And Amelia had been recruited to develop a curriculum that would prepare the next generation of cybersecurity professionals for the sophisticated threats they would face in an increasingly connected world. The students looking back at her represented some of the brightest minds in computer science, engineering, and public policy. But she knew that technical brilliance alone wouldn't be sufficient to protect society from the kinds of threats they would face. The Blackwood conspiracy had succeeded as far as it had not because of superior technology, but because of superior understanding of human psychology, institutional vulnerabilities, and the complex relationships between technical systems and social structures. Today, we're going to discuss something that isn't covered in most cybersecurity textbooks, she began, activating a display that showed a seemingly innocent 19th century journal. We're going to talk about how the most dangerous attacks often hide in plain sight, disguised as something completely benign. The journal on the screen was, of course, Marcus Blackwood's great-grandfather's diary. Now Evidence Exhibit A, in what had become known as the Infrastructure Conspiracy Trial of the Century. The legal proceedings were still ongoing, with hundreds of defendants across multiple countries facing charges ranging from conspiracy to commit terrorism to treason. But the technical lessons learned from analyzing the conspiracy's methods had already transformed how cybersecurity professionals thought about protecting critical infrastructure. "Who can tell me what made this attack so dangerous?" Amelia asked her students. A young woman in the front row raised her hand. The attackers had legitimate access to the systems they were planning to compromise. They didn't have to break in. They already had the keys. Exactly, Amelia confirmed. And what does that tell us about how we need to think about security? That the biggest threats often come from inside the system, another student offered. People who have been granted access through normal channels but who are using that access for malicious purposes. That's part of it, Amelia agreed. But there's something even more fundamental. The conspiracy succeeded in infiltrating critical infrastructure not through technical exploits, but through patient, systematic acquisition of legitimate business relationships. They bought their way into the systems they wanted to attack. This was the core insight that had emerged from the investigation of the Blackwood conspiracy. Traditional cybersecurity focused on preventing unauthorized access to systems, building better firewalls, implementing stronger authentication, detecting intrusions before they could cause damage. But the infrastructure conspiracy had bypassed all of those protections by becoming authorized users of the systems they wanted to exploit. Over a period of several years, companies controlled by the conspiracy had systematically acquired contracts to provide maintenance, monitoring, and management services for critical infrastructure systems across multiple cities and countries. Each individual contract appeared legitimate and was awarded through proper procurement processes. But collectively, they provided the conspiracy with comprehensive access to virtually every system that modern society depended upon for its basic functioning. This is what we call the Trojan horse model of infrastructure attack, Amelia explained to her students. Instead of trying to break down the gates, you convince the defenders to invite you inside and give you the keys. The implications for cybersecurity professionals were profound. Protecting critical infrastructure required not just technical security measures, but also careful oversight of the business relationships and contract arrangements that provided third parties with system access. It required understanding that cybersecurity was as much about human factors and institutional governance as it was about firewalls and encryption. But perhaps most importantly, it required recognizing that the most sophisticated adversaries were often patient enough to spend years positioning themselves for attacks that might not be launched until the timing was perfect for maximum impact. The Blackwood conspiracy spent over a decade acquiring the access they needed, Amelia continued. They were willing to operate legitimate businesses, provide real services, and build genuine reputations in order to position themselves for attacks that they might never have needed to launch. That level of patience and sophistication is what separates truly dangerous adversaries from the hackers and cybercriminals that most security systems are designed to stop. The class discussion that followed revealed how much the students had learned from studying the infrastructure conspiracy case. They understood that protecting critical systems required thinking like the most sophisticated attackers, patient, well-funded, and willing to work within legitimate channels to achieve malicious objectives. After class, Amelia returned to her office in the Institute's new building, which had been designed with security features that reflected lessons learned from the conspiracy investigation. Every room was equipped with sophisticated electronic countermeasures, communication systems were hardened against interception, and access controls were designed to prevent the kind of gradual infiltration that had enabled the Blackwood network to penetrate so many organizations. Her office walls were lined with awards and recognition she had received since reclaiming her identity as Dr. Amelia Chen. The cybersecurity community had embraced her return with an enthusiasm that helped heal some of the wounds from her experience 15 years earlier. She had been invited to consult with government agencies, speak at international conferences, and advise corporations on protecting their critical infrastructure from sophisticated threats. But the recognition that meant the most to her was a simple framed letter from Detective Sarah Martinez of the Seattle Police Department. Thanking her for the courage to step forward when doing so required risking everything she had built during 15 years of anonymity. The legal aftermath of Operation Revelation had been as complex and far-reaching as the conspiracy itself. Marcus Blackwood had been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, after pleading guilty to charges of conspiracy to commit terrorism, treason, and multiple counts of murder related to infrastructure attacks that had been carried out in other cities over the previous decade. Vincent Morrison, her former supervisor at CyberShield Technologies, had been sentenced to death, a penalty that reflected both the scale of his crimes and the duration of his criminal enterprise. The evidence revealed that Morrison had been operating similar conspiracies for over 20 years, using his positions in various cybersecurity companies to facilitate attacks that had killed hundreds of people and caused billions of dollars in economic damage. Deputy Director Sarah Hendricks of the FBI's Cybercrime Division had received a life sentence for her role in suppressing investigations and protecting key conspirators from law enforcement scrutiny. Her corruption had enabled the conspiracy to operate for years longer than would otherwise have been possible, directly contributing to casualties that could have been prevented if proper investigations had been allowed to proceed. In total, over 300 individuals in 12 countries had been convicted of charges related to the infrastructure conspiracy. The sentences ranged from decades in prison for lower-level participants to execution or life imprisonment for key organizers. The legal proceedings had taken nearly 2 years to complete, but the comprehensive nature of the prosecution had effectively dismantled the entire network and prevented any possibility of its reconstitution. Perhaps more importantly, the investigation had led to fundamental reforms in how critical infrastructure was managed and protected. New regulations required multiple independent oversight mechanisms for any contracts that provided third-party access to critical systems. Background investigations for key personnel were expanded to include detailed analysis of financial relationships and international connections. And coordination between agencies responsible for infrastructure protection was formalized to prevent the kind of compartmentalized approach that had enabled the conspiracy to operate without detection for so long. But for Amelia, the most satisfying outcome was the vindication that had finally come for her exposure of cybershield technologies 15 years earlier. The congressional committee that had once condemned her as a traitor had issued a formal apology, acknowledging that she had been correct about the corruption at CyberShield and that the evidence used to discredit her had been fabricated by the same network that was later exposed through the infrastructure conspiracy investigation. The apology had come with a Presidential Medal of Freedom, recognizing her courage in exposing corruption despite the personal cost, and her role in preventing what could have been the most devastating terrorist attack in American history. The ceremony had been attended by cybersecurity professionals from around the world, acknowledging her contributions to protecting critical infrastructure and her role in advancing the field's understanding of sophisticated threats. But the recognition that meant the most to her was much simpler. A quiet conversation with Marcus Wong after the ceremony, in which he told her that he was proud of the person she had become during 15 years of exile, and the courage she had shown in risking everything to protect innocent people. "You know," Marcus had said, "I think Amelia Parker might have been the best identity you ever created. Not because of the bookbinding skills or the quiet life in Seattle, but because she taught you that your worth isn't determined by other people's recognition of your accomplishments." He was right. The 15 years she had spent as Amelia Parker had been transformative in ways that went far beyond simply hiding from the people who wanted to destroy her career. She had learned to find satisfaction in work that helped others, to build relationships based on genuine human connection rather than professional networking, and to measure success by her own standards rather than external recognition. Those lessons had made her a better teacher, a more effective cybersecurity professional, and a stronger person. The quiet competence she had developed as a bookbinder had prepared her for the patient, methodical investigation that exposed the infrastructure conspiracy. The relationships she had built in Seattle's Capitol Hill community had taught her the importance of protecting people who didn't have the resources to protect themselves. And the years of living with the consequences of standing up for what was right had given her the courage to do it again when the stakes were even higher. As the second anniversary of Operation Revelation approached, Amelia found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from the wreckage of her first career to a position where she could help shape the future of cybersecurity education and critical infrastructure protection. The bookbinding shop on Pine Street had been converted into a small museum dedicated to the history of the infrastructure conspiracy and the investigation that exposed it. Visitors could see the actual journal that had contained the coded messages, learn about the cryptographic techniques that had been used to hide the conspiracy's plans, and understand how ordinary citizens could play a role in protecting their communities from sophisticated threats. But the exhibit that drew the most attention was a simple display case containing the tools she had used as a bookbinder. The same precision instruments that had enabled her to create perfect copies of the coded pages and preserve the evidence that brought down the conspiracy. The placard beside the display explained that sometimes the most important skills were the ones that seemed completely unrelated to the challenges you would eventually face. The Institute for Critical Infrastructure Security had grown rapidly since its establishment, attracting graduate students from around the world who wanted to learn from the lessons of the infrastructure conspiracy. The curriculum that Amelia had developed emphasized not just technical skills, but also the human factors and institutional vulnerabilities that sophisticated adversaries exploited to achieve their objectives. Her students were already making their mark in cybersecurity organizations around the world, applying the analytical techniques and strategic thinking they had learned to identify and prevent emerging threats. Several had been recruited by law enforcement agencies specifically because of their training in the kind of patient, systematic investigation that had exposed the Blackwood network. But perhaps the most important impact of her teaching was less tangible. She was helping to create a generation of cybersecurity professionals who understood that protecting critical infrastructure was ultimately about protecting people, not just systems. The technical aspects of cybersecurity were important, but they were meaningless unless they served the broader purpose of enabling society to function safely and equitably. On a rainy Thursday morning in November, exactly 2 years after the night that Project Reset had been prevented, Amelia received a visitor in her office that she hadn't expected. Detective Martinez had driven up from Seattle to deliver something that she said couldn't be sent through the mail or discussed over the phone. "I wanted to give you this personally," Martinez said, handing her a sealed envelope. "It's from one of Blackwood's co-conspirators who just finished serving his sentence. He insisted that it be delivered to you specifically." The letter was from David Chen, no relation, a low-level technical specialist who had worked for Apex Technologies and participated in the early stages of the infrastructure conspiracy before developing second thoughts about the operation. He had been sentenced to 5 years in prison for his role in the conspiracy, but had cooperated fully with investigators and provided crucial testimony that helped convict higher-level organizers. The letter was brief but moving. "Dr. Chen, I wanted to thank you for having the courage to expose what we were planning. I joined the conspiracy because I was told we were developing better security systems to protect critical infrastructure. By the time I realized what we were actually doing, I was too afraid to speak up. Your example showed me that it's never too late to do the right thing, even when the personal cost is high. I'm now working with a nonprofit organization that helps whistleblowers report corporate corruption safely. I hope that others will find the same courage you showed and that fewer people will make the mistakes I made. Thank you for saving lives, including my own conscience." The letter was a reminder that the infrastructure conspiracy had involved hundreds of people, many of whom had been recruited through deception or gradually corrupted through incremental participation in increasingly unethical activities. Not everyone who had participated in the conspiracy was a willing collaborator, and some had genuinely believed they were working to improve security rather than planning attacks. But it was also a reminder that moral courage was often contagious. Her decision to risk everything to expose the conspiracy had inspired others to come forward with information that proved crucial to the investigation. Several key breakthroughs in the case had come from people who had been peripherally involved in the conspiracy, but who found the courage to cooperate with investigators after learning about her example. "There's something else," Detective Martinez said as Amelia finished reading the letter. "The FBI has asked me to discuss a consulting opportunity with you. They're developing a new unit focused on preventing infrastructure attacks, and they need someone with your expertise to help design their training program." The offer was tempting, and it represented the kind of official recognition that would have meant everything to her 15 years earlier. But Amelia found that her priorities had changed during her years of teaching and reflection. "I'm honored by the offer," she said, "but I think I can do more good where I am. The students I'm training will eventually work for agencies like the FBI, and they'll be better prepared for the challenges they'll face because of what they're learning here." Martinez nodded approvingly. "I thought you might say that, but I was asked to tell you that the offer remains open if you ever change your mind." After Martinez left, Amelia returned to preparing for her afternoon class, which would cover a topic that she had developed specifically for advanced students: the psychology of long-term undercover operations and the personal costs of maintaining false identities for extended periods. It was a subject she was uniquely qualified to teach, having spent 15 years living as someone completely different from who she really was. But it was also a subject that she approached with some trepidation because it required her to discuss aspects of her experience that she had never fully processed even in her own mind. The class discussion was intense and personal in ways that surprised her. Several students revealed that they had experience with undercover work or had family members who had lived under assumed identities for security reasons. The conversation that emerged was about more than just operational security techniques. It was about the fundamental questions of identity, authenticity, and the psychological costs of living a life that wasn't entirely your own. The hardest part, one student observed, isn't maintaining the technical aspects of a false identity. It's remembering who you really are underneath the role you're playing. That's exactly right, Amelia agreed. And it raises an important question. When you spend years living as someone else, do you eventually become that person? Or do you find ways to integrate the different aspects of your identity into something new? It was a question she was still answering for herself. Dr. Amelia Chen had returned to public life, but she had been fundamentally changed by 15 years of living as Amelia Parker. The quiet competence, patient craftsmanship, and focus on helping others that she had developed as a bookbinder had become integral parts of who she was as a cybersecurity professional and teacher. She no longer wanted the high-profile consulting contracts and media attention that had once defined her career. Instead, she found deep satisfaction in the methodical work of educating the next generation, and the knowledge that her students would go on to protect critical infrastructure in ways that honored the lessons learned from the infrastructure conspiracy. As the academic year progressed, Amelia began working on a book that would document the complete story of the infrastructure conspiracy and the investigation that exposed it. The book would serve multiple purposes: preserving the historical record of one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in modern history, providing a detailed case study for cybersecurity professionals, and offering a personal account of the costs and rewards of standing up for what was right, even when doing so required enormous sacrifice. But perhaps most importantly, the book would be a tribute to the hundreds of people who had played roles in exposing and preventing the conspiracy: law enforcement officers, intelligence analysts, prosecutors, journalists, and ordinary citizens who had provided crucial information or support at critical moments. The investigation and prosecution of the infrastructure conspiracy had been a collaborative effort that demonstrated what was possible when dedicated professionals worked together across organizational boundaries and national borders. It had shown that even the most sophisticated criminal enterprises could be defeated by patient, systematic investigation and the courage of individuals who were willing to put public safety ahead of personal interest. The final chapter of the book would be dedicated to the question that students asked her most frequently: how could ordinary people protect themselves and their communities from sophisticated threats that operated through legitimate channels and were often invisible until it was too late to prevent them? Her answer was both simple and complex. By paying attention to the details that seemed unimportant, by asking questions when things didn't seem quite right, and by having the courage to speak up when they discovered information that suggested criminal activity or threats to public safety. The infrastructure conspiracy had been exposed not because of sophisticated surveillance systems or advanced investigative techniques, but because one person had noticed that something about Marcus Blackwood's journal wasn't quite what it appeared to be. The coded messages that brought down a global criminal enterprise had been hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the right combination of knowledge, curiosity, and moral courage to recognize them for what they really were. The most important lesson, she would write in the book's conclusion, is that protecting our society from sophisticated threats isn't just the responsibility of law enforcement officers and cybersecurity professionals. It's the responsibility of every citizen who cares enough to pay attention to what's happening around them and who has the courage to act when action is needed. 5 years after Operation Revelation, Seattle's Capitol Hill district looked much the same as it always had. Coffee shops and bookstores lined the narrow streets. Residents walked their dogs in the small parks, and the rhythm of daily life continued with the comfortable predictability that made the neighborhood so appealing to people who valued community over excitement. But visitors who looked carefully might notice a small bronze plaque mounted on the brick building that had once housed timeless books and binding. The plaque read simply, "In recognition of the quiet heroes who protect our communities by paying attention to details that others might miss, by asking questions when things don't seem right, and by having the courage to act when action is needed." Below the inscription was a quote that had become the unofficial motto of the Institute for Critical Infrastructure Security. Sometimes the most important battles are fought by people whose names are never known, whose victories are never celebrated, and whose courage is measured not by the recognition they receive, but by the lives they save. The building itself now housed a nonprofit organization called the Citizen Security Institute, which provided resources and training for ordinary people who wanted to help protect their communities from various threats. The organization offered workshops on recognizing signs of criminal activity, reporting suspicious behavior safely, and supporting whistleblowers who came forward with information about corruption or illegal activities. Dr. Amelia Chen visited the institute regularly, both to teach workshops and to remember the 15 years she had spent living quietly in the apartment above what was now the conference room, where citizens learned to be more effective guardians of their own communities. Her book, The Infrastructure Conspiracy: Lessons in Courage, Patience, and the Power of Paying Attention, had become required reading for cybersecurity professionals around the world. But its broader impact was among ordinary citizens who had learned from her example that they had both the capability and the responsibility to help protect their communities from sophisticated threats. The Institute's walls were lined with letters from people who had used skills learned in the workshops to identify and report various forms of criminal activity, from financial fraud to human trafficking to terrorist planning. Each letter was a reminder that the most effective defense against sophisticated adversaries was an informed and engaged citizenry that understood how to recognize threats and had the courage to act on that knowledge. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came in the form of a simple handwritten note from a young woman named Sarah Parker. She had chosen the surname in honor of Amelia's former identity, who had been inspired by the infrastructure conspiracy case to pursue a career in cybersecurity. Sarah was now a graduate student at the Institute for Critical Infrastructure Security, and her research focused on developing early warning systems that could detect the kind of patient, systematic infiltration that had enabled the Blackwood network to penetrate so many critical systems. "Your example taught me that the most important qualification for protecting others isn't technical expertise or official authority," Sarah had written. "It's the willingness to pay attention to details that seem unimportant, to ask questions when things don't seem right, and to have the courage to act when you discover information that could save lives. Thank you for showing me that anyone can be a hero if they're willing to put other people's safety ahead of their own comfort." The note was displayed prominently in Amelia's office, alongside awards from professional organizations and recognition from government agencies. but it was the handwritten message from a student that reminded her daily of why her work mattered and what she hoped to accomplish through teaching and writing. The field of cybersecurity had been transformed by the lessons learned from the infrastructure conspiracy investigation. New technologies and techniques were important, but the focus had shifted toward understanding the human factors and institutional vulnerabilities that sophisticated adversaries exploited to achieve their objectives. The next generation of cybersecurity professionals was being trained to think like patient, well-funded adversaries who were willing to spend years positioning themselves for attacks that might never be launched. But perhaps more importantly, the investigation had demonstrated that protecting critical infrastructure was ultimately about protecting people, not just the technical systems that modern society depended upon, but the human communities that those systems served. The most sophisticated technical defenses were meaningless unless they were designed and operated by people who understood that their ultimate responsibility was to enable others to live safely and freely. On quiet evenings, when her teaching responsibilities were complete and her research was finished for the day, Amelia sometimes found herself walking through Capitol Hill's familiar streets, remembering the 15 years she had spent living as someone completely different from who she really was. Those had been difficult years in many ways. Years of isolation, frustration, and the constant awareness that her true capabilities were being wasted on tasks that seemed far less important than the work she had once done. But they had also been transformative years that had taught her lessons she could never have learned any other way. She had discovered the deep satisfaction that came from work that directly helped other people, the importance of building relationships based on genuine human connection rather than professional networking, and the peace that came from measuring success by her own standards rather than external recognition. Most importantly, she had learned that courage wasn't about being fearless or supremely confident. It was about being afraid, but doing what needed to be done anyway. About accepting that doing the right thing often came with significant personal costs, and about finding the strength to keep going even when the path forward was unclear and the outcome uncertain. The woman who had once been Dr. Amelia Chen, then Amelia Parker, and was now Dr. Amelia Chen again had discovered that identity wasn't about the name on your driver's license or the job description on your business card. It was about the values you lived by, the choices you made when no one was watching, and the legacy you left through the lives you touched and the knowledge you passed on to others. As she walked past the building that had once housed her bookbinding shop, Amelia reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from the wreckage of her first career to a position where she could help shape the future of cybersecurity education and critical infrastructure protection. The path had been longer and more complicated than anything she could have imagined, but it had led her to exactly where she needed to be. The quiet bookbinder who had discovered coded messages in an antique journal had become a teacher, author, and advocate whose influence would extend far beyond her own lifetime through the students she trained and the principles she helped establish for protecting society from sophisticated threats. But more than any professional accomplishment, she had learned that the most important victories were often achieved by people whose names were never known, whose work was never celebrated, and whose courage was measured not by the recognition they received, but by the lives they saved. In the end, that was enough. It was more than enough. The story of Dr. Amelia Chen had become a testament to the power of patience, the importance of paying attention to details that others might miss, and the extraordinary impact that ordinary people could have when they found the courage to act on their convictions. It was a reminder that in a world filled with sophisticated threats and complex challenges, the most important qualification for making a difference wasn't technical expertise or official authority. It was the willingness to care enough to pay attention, to ask questions when things didn't seem right, and to have the courage to act when action was needed, even when doing so required sacrificing everything you had worked to build and everything you thought you wanted to become. Sometimes the most important heroes were the ones who never expected to be heroes at all. They were the quiet guardians who chose to protect others, not because it was their job or because they would be recognized for their efforts, but because it was the right thing to do, and because they understood that in a complex and dangerous world, everyone had a responsibility to help keep their communities safe. The bronze plaque on Capitol Hill would remain long after the specific details of the infrastructure conspiracy had faded from public memory. But its message would continue to inspire ordinary people to extraordinary acts of courage, reminding them that they had both the capability and the responsibility to be the quiet heroes their communities needed. And in classrooms around the world, Dr. Amelia Chen would continue teaching students that the most sophisticated technical defenses were meaningless unless they were guided by people who understood that their ultimate purpose was not to protect systems, but to protect the human lives and communities that those systems served. The Bookbinder's Secret had become the foundation for a new understanding of what it meant to be a guardian in the digital age. Patient, observant, and courageously committed to protecting others no matter the personal cost. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most. And where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.